Frame rate in games is important. Frame rate is your gateway to the illusion of fluid motion. Frame rate is, to a decent degree, what dictates how responsive a game feels. Frame rate can sometimes even affect how systems within a game function. But frame rate is also misunderstood. So I figured today we could talk a bit about why frame rate is important, but also why hitting a target frame rate isn't often as simple as we might believe. Particularly since more and more people are caring more and more about frame rates these days. But I see a lot of people doing it in a very uneducated way. Now, obviously, YouTube doesn't allow us to watch content in 120 FPS, so even if I had games I could play at such a high frame rate, I couldn't really showcase the difference to you. Doubly so if you don't have a 120Hz display to watch from. But that's okay, because what I want to talk about today is actually a misconception about frame rates that a lot of people have, related to the challenge of rendering a scene at double your previous frame rate target. While it's technically true that doubling frame rate in a vacuum requires double the rendering budget available in terms of hardware power, or splitting the amount of rendering budget required in half, and that it can more or less split in half input response and double image smoothness, this doesn't really tell the whole story on its own. Many people think of this linearly, as if you just add more frames onto the end. Here you have 5 frames, then you add 5 more and you have 10, right? But remember what FPS stands for, frames per second. That means you're not just tacking on more frames to the end. It has to fit into the same space you already had, like this. You basically have 2 ways to look at it. Either you're expecting twice as much work in the same amount of time, or you're offering half the amount of time to get the same amount of work done as before. Either way, doubling the frame rate is a 100% increase in technical workload per second for a lot of systems. That's why frame times are equally as important to look at, rather than just the raw frame rate number. At 30 FPS, you have 33.3 milliseconds to render each frame. 60 FPS sees that number drop down to 16.7 milliseconds, so half the rendering budget. And 120 FPS is just 8.3 milliseconds per frame, again half of 60 FPS. But notice that this means at 120 FPS, you're having to render things 4 times faster than 30 frames per second. Makes sense, it's 4 times as many frames in the same amount of time, but think about the ramifications of that. Any small hiccup that would cause a 1 frame drop at 30 frames per second, a drop that most people wouldn't even notice, is a 2 frame drop at 60 frames per second, and a 4 frame drop at 120 frames per second. 2 frame drop at 30 frames per second, which you'll probably notice if you're comfortable with paying attention to frame rates, is an 8 frame drop at 120 FPS. Unfortunately, optimization doesn't always scale linearly like this either. Rendering expectations from frame to frame can vary wildly thanks to player control over the scene. Doubly so in games that require advanced physics simulations, AI systems, or anything else that's particularly taxing on the CPU, and or can also be affected more randomly by outside factors. The player being in control of the game means it can't just guarantee that every system is optimized to be half as intensive across all frames. You may be able to get some systems to guarantee task completion twice as quickly on average, but you can't easily guarantee that when it fails to reach this average, it won't go far above the previous rendering budget you had at 60 FPS or even 30 FPS. The only way to more or less ensure that this won't have a very large impact on your frame rate at 120 FPS is literally to double the power of your hardware in relation to whatever is causing the dips. This matters to the end user, whether it's on console or PC. Your PC doesn't randomly get more powerful on some days than others if you roll high on a D20. And your console is the same for an entire console generation of games. So with that fixed hardware configuration in mind, the game can't just ask for more power as a solution. What this often means is that when you drop frames at 120 frames per second, you'll drop much harder than at 60 or 30. Dropping from 120 to 90 FPS is thankfully a smaller stutter than from 60 FPS than 30 FPS. Half as large, in fact, despite both of them dropping 30 FPS. Because remember, as long as you're above 60 FPS, any drop from 120 FPS is going to be less in terms of total frame time than the time it takes to render 60 FPS, thanks to the fact that 60 FPS is literally double the frame time. This is why performance percentages are generally more informative than raw performance metrics. A 15 FPS drop from 120 FPS is a 12.5% drop in performance, but a 15 FPS drop from 60 is suddenly a 25% drop, with 15 FPS at 30 literally being a 50% drop in performance, despite still being the same amount of lost frames as 60 and 120. The good thing is that allows you to drop more frames at higher frame rates and have it affect your gameplay less than it otherwise would. If you're playing games at higher frame rates, don't be so hard on yourself, your rig, your settings, or the game when it can't hold steady, because the more frames you're trying to render in a single second, the more unpredictable optimization can be. There are always going to be limits to how far you can compress certain tasks, just like there are always going to be limits to how far you can fold up different pieces of clothing that are made of different materials to fit them in a drawer. Some will simply fold better than others. It's also very important to understand what's more valuable for a given game in terms of frame rate. My number one rule at 60 FPS or below is stability is more important than target. I also don't really have a problem with games running at 30 FPS. A lot of people who today are hardcore frame rate snobs don't actually know much about frame rates. They just want higher numbers arbitrarily because PC elitist or whatever. But then they'll push people to play games like Ocarina of Time or Final Fantasy VII in their original forms because they're also retro masterpieces or whatever. Well, did you know many N64 and PS1 games actually targeted at just 20 FPS? Ocarina and Majora's Mask both do, and they can be unstable at that. While the instability and lower frame rate might make the game feel kinda sluggish in a way, it's also not a super demanding game in terms of player inputs. It's slow and combat is simple. And 20 FPS divides evenly into 60 Hz, so as long as the frame rate is stable and there are no frame pacing issues, it'll visually appear more smooth than an unstable 21 to 29 FPS would. Battles in Final Fantasy VII actually visually update at just 15 FPS, with the menus in battle running at 60. Did you notice? Did it bother you? Probably not, and it's a turn-based game, so why does it matter to gameplay? These choices allowed the devs to allocate more processing power to other things that might not have otherwise been possible on their original hardware. Temporal resolution in games, how fluid motion is thanks to the frame rate, is important for a lot of games. It affects image clarity and perceived resolution when in motion, as well as has an impact on the perceived quality of some visual effects. And again, higher frame rates boost input response. But it's also more important to some games than others. If you're playing Tetris, temporal resolution really doesn't matter. The target frame rate should largely depend on the goals of the game. You wouldn't want an RTS to be stripped of all of its features purely because the complexity of them in terms of AI and visuals can incur ridiculous frame rate penalties, right? You want that meaty RTS experience, not 120 frames per second with a super simplified RTS. Especially because you don't need ridiculous response times or higher temporal resolution for an RTS to look good, feel good, and be fair to play. It is important that we've gotten away from the instability of frame rates in the past. It's important that more developers have learned to take frame pacing into account. It's great that more games are targeting higher frame rates early on in development, and it's awesome that even console users now are getting access to frame rate options higher than 60 FPS. But it's also important to understand that that one number, that one metric, isn't everything. A higher frame rate doesn't always mean a better game, particularly if you have to sacrifice design to get there. And the higher your target, the more difficult it is to maintain. Like I outlined above, it's not strictly a linear problem, and bottlenecks and challenges will manifest differently at different target frame rates. Something that wasn't a problem at all at 60 FPS because of the extra rendering budget you had might be at its optimization limits already, and make 120 FPS too difficult to maintain when everything else is further compressed in terms of rendering budget. Suddenly, the smallest resource hog before becomes the biggest, and you can't do much about it. We as a community should definitely keep pushing for consistent, optimized target frame rates, but we should also be understanding of some amount of unpredictability and not get upset when a game targets something like 60 without 120 FPS mode, or targets 30 instead of 60. And we should also be welcoming to 40 FPS modes as a standard alternative for those that have 120Hz displays. The point is, we have options, and gaming frame rates are already far higher and more consistently stable across the industry than they ever have been. The PS2 era may have had a fair amount of games that targeted 60 FPS, but a lot of the games were still super unstable. We're getting away from that finally, so despite still wanting to see things improve, we shouldn't forsake that we already have improved. But what do you guys think? What are your frame rate preferences and why? Can you even tell when a frame rate is higher, lower, or unstable? What's something you hope to see in frame rate optimization in the future? Sound off in the comments below, and I'll see you guys next time.